Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the Water is a Negro spiritual. It's a song that the African slaves would sing when they were trying to warn the slaves that were escaping from slavery. They were warning them to walk in the riverbanks so that the dogs would not smell or pick up their scent. The reason for that was because if an escaped slave was caught, they risked being maimed or murdered. This evening, I was asked to come and speak to you about Black excellence. And in order to do that effectively, I have to speak to you about Black history. Within this story of Black history I'm going to tell you today, you're going to hear about discrimination and struggle, but you're also going to hear about understanding and triumph, which creates excellence. During the month of February, typically songs like Wade in the Water are remembered, and stories of historical accounts about the transatlantic slave trade are told. We are reminded of the estimated 70 million Africans that were transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas to be enslaved in the European colonies. What the Africans now call ma'afa. The reason for the need of the slave was because cheap labor was needed, especially on the plantations for agricultural labor. Now, did you know that most of the first slaves that were brought in the 13 British colonies were imported from the Caribbean and not directly from Africa? In fact, the first Africans to arrive in England arrived in 1555 to do business, to trade. It wasn't until 1655, when the British were in need of a larger labor force, that indentured servants from Britain, West Africa, and Native Americans were used. Eventually, indentured servants became too costly, and the Dutch brought over the first African slaves to the Americas. And as the need for the labor force grew to create more wealth in Europe, so did the slave trade. It's okay. The transatlantic slave trade is primarily where the history of Black people begins in North America. It's a history that's filled with struggle, deprivation, fear, and injustice. And we consistently hear about 300 years of slavery and the 100 years of Jim Crow to follow. Now, Jim Crow is what is the equivalent in America to the South Africa's apartheid. It's where it was legal to separate Blacks and whites. During Black History Month, we hear about the Civil Rights Movement, and we celebrate the leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Viola Desmond, who is now on our $10 bill, and Malcolm X. And all of this is a part of Black history. It's really a part of world history. But there is a time before that. Now I'm going to need my 4 volunteers to come up here. I have 4 volunteers that have kindly been willing to help me out with this. And we're going to do a bit of a timeline. So just come on up. Roll it out. Okay. So Carrie, you are going to represent 4.5 billion years ago when the Earth started. Okay? And then Maya, you're going to represent today, the 21st. Actually, no, Melissa, you're going to represent today. Okay? The year 2019. And then you are going to represent the start of the slave trade. So come all the way over here. Or over there. Sorry. I've got myself backwards. You're going to go beside Melissa. And then you're going to represent the start of man. The first fossils of man were found about 200,000 years ago in Ethiopia. So you're going to be about right here. Now keep in mind, I understand that this isn't to scale, okay? That's okay. But what I want you to see is that we can see that there is over 150,000 years prior to the slave trade. And that history is rich. There's this belief that the Africans that were brought over were ripped away from unsophisticated cultures and lucky to be brought to a more civilized land. However, the ancient Africans developed advanced cultures of art, education, and architecture. There were kingdoms in various parts of the continent. In fact, the very first universities in the world were in Timbuktu. There were kingdoms and there were sophisticated trade systems with China, with India, and Europe. This history is not readily taught in our schools, nor is it readily found on the internet. But this blip of 400 years, that blip does not negate the thousands of years of excellence that Black people experienced. And that excellence remains in our DNA, literally in our DNA. Thank you. You can go. Let's give them a hand. Scientists have been studying human DNA for decades. What they're finding out through the study of epigenetics is that experiences from generations ago impact their descendants of today. Every experience we have leaves a marker that can alter the way our DNA is expressed. Epigenetics is the study of the modification of gene expression. So, the manner in which you play today can impact the manner in which your great-great-great-great-grandchild plays tomorrow. I'm going to give you an example. I am the mother of 3 children. My middle child, Kobe, he's now 12 years old. He's running around here somewhere. When he was about 4 or 5 years old, he would get his pencils, he'd get his crayons, anything that was long, and he would put them in a line. And then he'd go, pew, 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 pew. And he would just do that for hours. One evening, I was in the kitchen cooking dinner, and he was in the kitchen with me with his pencils and crayons going, pew, 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 pew. You ever notice that when you're trying to do something, your kids want to be right up under you? Anyways, he was quiet, he was playing. I was like, okay, fine, you stay there. Well, his dad came home. And usually when his dad comes home, he would greet me and then he would play with the kids. But this time he came home and he came into the kitchen and he just stood there. And I'm like, what's wrong? And he's like, Jen, who taught Kobe to do that? I'm like, do what? The child's playing. He's like, who taught him to put the pencils and the pencil crayons all in a row like that? And who taught him to go pew, 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 pew? I'm like, I don't know. And he says, Jen, I'm not lying. God's truth. When I was 4 years old, I would line up my pencils and my pencil crayons and my markers, and I would go pew, 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 pew. Now, at the time, I thought, wow, that is a really weird coincidence. But now I'm learning that it's part of epigenetics. Now, you might be wondering, okay, that's a really cute story, Jen, but what does that have to do with Black excellence? And I tell you this story to demonstrate in a rather simplistic way how our past directly impacts our now. Now, you remember that timeline that we just demonstrated? For hundreds of thousands of years, Black people were leaders in medicine, education, trade, astrology, and the list goes on. However, for 400 years, and probably the most recent 400 years, Black people have been told that they are less than. They are hopeless. They won't amount to anything. They're not as good as. And these messages have impacted generations of Black people, resulting in a group of people feeling and living lives that are lost, stuck, in poverty, and starting behind the start line. This is before ever being exposed to a life where they may face discrimination and hatred just for the color of their skin. Those messages and the result of that brutal treatment during those 400 years, that's in our DNA. but so are the royal bloodlines, the leadership of our ancestors, and the ingenuity of our forefathers. It's the resilience of a nation. Today, yes, as a group, Black people struggle due to systemic racism, discrimination, and the fallout of colonialism. But look at where we have come just in 80 years. In spite of systemic racism, discrimination, and the fallout of colonialism. That resilience is part of our DNA. It didn't happen in isolation. We had support and we had help from those who were also discriminated against and those who were empathetic to the injustices that have been performed. Now we're going to do a little exercise, and it's going to require group participation. In the United States, there is an educator and an anti-racist activist named Jane Elliott. Have you heard of her before? Jane Elliott, okay. And she did an experiment with children relating to eye color to show the injustice of racism. And so I'm going to do a variation of that today. So what I'd like you to do is look at the person next to you. I want you to look deep into their eyes. Okay. I want you to look at the person next to you. And for the purposes of this exercise, I want the brown-eyed people to know that you are the superior group within the human race. You have access to education, finances, and you're considered an equal without question. You are expected to sit in power positions and you are expected to govern your country. Now, if you have blue eyes or green eyes or any other color eyes than brown, you're automatically considered inferior. You are told you are inferior by your community, by the media, by institutions that will not recognize your basic human rights. If you become involved with the legal system, you are more likely to experience harsher consequences than your brown-eyed peers. You are not considered equal. All of this before you've had an opportunity to say a word. You are automatically judged by the color of your eyes. Let that sink in. That is racism. When a certain group of people they don't have the same access to what another group of people have because of the color of their skin. When I was a young girl, my father would constantly tell my sister and I, that's us when we were little, he would constantly tell my sister and I that we were Black children and we had to be better than, we had to do better in order to succeed. And he said being part of the norm is just not an option if you want to experience success. If I came home on report card day, and on that report card there's 15 marks, and I got 8 A's and 7 B's, true story, I kid you not. The first thing out of my father's mouth, what happened to the other 7 A's? It's experiences like that and others within my family that made me feel like, being Black is a burden. And growing up, I would have to read about and watch historical accounts of how white people mistreated Black people, and that white people would never see me as an equal. And as a teenager, I would roll my eyes when my dad spoke to me about racism. I'd just be like, oh, whatever. Because my friends, they were all white, and they treated me well. Now, if I'm honest, I will admit that I did always feel a little bit different, because my hair was different, my skin color was different, my culture was different. But I believed that if I somehow was able to fit in and be accepted, then I could prove my dad wrong, because what I really wanted to do was prove that man wrong. But as I grew up, I realized that being different made me somewhat of a target. And not necessarily a bad target, but a target or a token nonetheless. Now, as mentioned, I've been a social worker for the last 20 years. And during that time, most of my time was spent at the Children's Aid Society. And during that time, when clients would get upset with me, they would try to hurt me the best way that they knew how, and that was with their words. So a number of times I would be called black bitch, or I would be called nigger. My agency was very good. They supported me through that, and they worked with me. But one day I just took a step back, because my agency, they like to say that they are diverse, and they were trying, they did try. But when I looked around, there was nobody in leadership that looked like me. In fact, in 2011, I was the first to be hired as a supervisor at the Children's Aid Society. At that time, the agency had been open for over 118 years. When I was in university, during the mid-90s, they wanted to the leadership, and I'm going to talk about leadership for a little bit. They wanted to cancel Black History Month. A nationally recognized month, they wanted to cancel it because they didn't want to be exclusionary. They wanted to be inclusive. So they wanted to call it Diversity Month. Those are just a few instances that happened to me, just a few throughout my life. Within the city of London, you heard about Harold Usher, who was voted to be the first Black city councilor in the year 2000. By that time, London had already been 200 years old. In 2018, we elected our first Black female into city council, Ariel Kayabana. And yes, we should celebrate these firsts. I don't want to take away from them. But in a time, the 21st century, when we are told that we're supposed to be equal, it doesn't make sense to me how we have so many firsts if we live in an equal world. So let's go back to my father's messages of working hard and striving to be the best. In 2015, my son Kobe, when he was 8 years old, he came home from school and he said to me, as I was making him a snack, he said, "Mommy," I'm like, "Yes, baby." "Mommy, what does nigger mean?" Have you ever felt like your heart was in your throat and you just couldn't speak? That's how I felt at that moment. But somehow I was able to say, "Sweetie, who told you that word? Where did you hear that word?" And he said to me, "Well, Mommy, a boy at school called me nigger, and I knew it wasn't good. So what does it mean?" And at that moment, I had so much rage in me. I was thinking, who could dare call my baby that word? And I wanted to march over to that school and I wanted to deal with that kid. However, I knew that wouldn't be the greatest look given that I was in child protection. It wouldn't really work. So I said to him, I said, "Sweetie, I'm so sorry that someone called you that word. That's an ugly word. It's a word that has been used for a number of years to make Black people feel like they are less than. But I want you to know that you are beautiful. You are intelligent. And I love you. And I don't want you to ever feel any different." You know what that child said to me? He looked at me with those beautiful brown eyes. And he said, "I know, I'm the man." And he said, "I just went off and I played soccer with my friends." Obviously, the situation traumatized me more than it did him. But the experience taught me that I had to prepare my boys for the world that they live in and not the world that I wished they lived in. I had to do as my father did to me and instill the message that being average was not good enough. Because when they go out into society, they're not going to be viewed as equal to their non-Black peers. In many instances, they are viewed as starting behind the starting line. At that moment, I fully understood why my father instilled the messages that lifted us up. I understood at that moment why I do as I do and to encourage others to lift them up, and to help them to believe in themselves. It's because it's in my DNA to be excellent, to teach, and to excel. It is why I have achieved all that I have achieved despite the world that I live in. I had to take off my rose-colored glasses and look at the world for what it is. And we see evidence of how far we've come with the election of Barack Obama in the USA. He was the first black president. However, we also see how far we have to go with the aftermath of the election of Donald Trump. Black excellence is not a choice. Black excellence is a necessity. In order to have people that look like me in positions where decisions that impact organizations and systems are made, Black excellence has to become a way of life. Having a seat at the table means that you have had to rise above and be better than the norm. Institutions such as TD Canada Trust are learning to understand this, and it's one of the reasons that initiatives such as this one have been made part of their strategic plan and have been pushed through. The mere fact that you have been employed by this institution is evidence that you are one of the top performers. You walk amongst the best. TD Canada Trust understands how the system works and is wanting to provide a hand up so that in the decade approaching us, titles such as the first Black CEO, the first Black office manager, the first Black investment supervisor is no longer a novelty or a surprise, but an expectation that people who look like me are in every facet of an organization, from the front line to the C-suite. Now, does this mean that you may have to learn your role inside and out better than the average person? And does it mean that doing the things that average people won't do so that you can have what the average people do have? And does it mean that you have to learn about your history so that it can motivate you to move forward? You're damn right that's what it means. And for our non-Black brothers and sisters, epigenetics happens both ways. Although our ancestors' past has impacted us as Black people, your ancestors' past has also impacted you within your position. To be born white automatically puts you in a power position. Remember our brown eye, blue eye exercise? It's a harsh truth. But Martin Luther King Jr. said that evil things happen when good people stay silent. Excellence is for all of us to do. No matter what the skin color, no matter what the eye color, no matter what the culture. Speak up when you see injustice and become aware of your biases and discriminatory attitudes, because we all have them. But in order to change them, we must become aware. That is how change happens, through awareness. Ladies and gentlemen, we can choose to focus on the struggle, or we can choose to tap into the strength of our ancestors. Everything we do is a choice. Why not choose excellence? I thank you so much for having me here today.